Hi there, my name is Jen Briselli and I am the VP of Experience Strategy and Service Design at MadPow, and I am here to talk to you about interactive journey maps. This is going to be a presentation based on a talk that I have given a couple of different places now, UXPA Boston as well as Big Design Conference in Dallas. And I know there's a lot of interest in sharing this to folks who are not able to join those conferences. So I'm going to record my talk and try to incorporate some of the common questions that I hear during Q&A into that as well. So as the title suggests, let's talk about interactive journey maps. And when we talk about journey maps, this can mean a lot of different things. We have found at MadPow over the past several years that the world of journey mapping and service blueprinting and similar types of strategy artifacts has really grown, become more complicated, but also become more robust. And the richness of these artifacts can really do a lot of things that they really didn't do and that nobody realized they could do maybe 10 years ago. One of those things has included the introduction of interactivity to enhance the value and usefulness of these types of artifacts. So I want to start with a little bit of a story. A friend of mine who has a very similar background to mine, I would say she is pretty much equivalent in terms of tech savvy and general preferences for things. She and I were talking about making plans and asked me, at some point, how am I going to get to where we're going to meet? And I just said, I don't know. I've never been there. I'll probably just open up Google Maps on my phone and follow the turn-by-turn directions. And it's that point that I realized she still uses MapQuest. Granted, she does not print out the MapQuest directions like we all did in the early 2000s, but she admitted that she still uses the MapQuest website just because it was a matter of habit, and that's what she had always used. And she does use the turn-by-turn directions, but that's really all that she uses it for, and it's still her first go-to for mapping her way to a destination. And as we chatted a little bit and I was done chuckling at her, I kind of realized she and I are using maps in fundamentally different ways. She is really just using MapQuest as a digitized version of a paper map. Sure, she does use the voice directions sometimes, but in essence, she's basically using MapQuest as a replacement for a partner or a friend sitting in the passenger seat with an atlas in their hands. Meanwhile, I'm using Google Maps, and I've been using it long enough that I almost think of the map functionality as secondary, maybe even tertiary behind some of the other features that it involves. So we know that we can certainly get directions, but also Google Maps provides a lot of information about the destination. It's also got some features like search along the route for other things. For example, if I want to find a gas station or a coffee shop between where I'm at and where I'm going, I can find those and add them to my route, to my navigation. So in reality, Google Maps has become a resource that helps me not only get where I'm going, but also decide where I'm going to go, as well as how to get there. In fact, sometimes when I'm looking for information about a destination, maybe I want to see the hours of operation, I'll just pull up Google Maps and look at it there, rather than try to navigate to the business website and figure out where on their website they have those hours listed and so forth. So yes, Google Maps provides a map and directions. That's sort of the core concept of mapping software. But they've made use of the interactivity here in ways that make it more than just a digitized navigator. And that's what I want to talk about today. How can interactivity make a journey map more than just a digital version of a print artifact? So before we get into some of what we've learned at MadPow, I want to get back to the very basic concept of a map, just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about maps and journey maps specifically. So maps can obviously do a lot of things. Maps help us know where we're at. They help us understand the lay of the land in our current situation. They also help us understand where we're trying to go. If we are headed for a destination, whether physical or otherwise, that we are less familiar with, they help us get the lay of the land in that new place and how we will know when we're there. They also help us plan the route to get there. So if I know where I am at and I know where I want to be, I also need to figure out a way to get from my current situation or environment to a future state or environment. And once we're actually embarked on that journey, they help us navigate along the way. They help us understand how we might react to a diversion or a change in plan. They give us new options when we encounter a barrier or an obstacle. And they help us, as we go to find that destination, know how far we have come in the trip. Well, journey maps do all of this as well. But interactivity can help them do it better. And before I go too far down into journey maps, I also want to make sure that folks who are less familiar with journey mapping as a process understand what we mean. Journey maps can take a lot of different forms, but generally, this is an example of what I'm talking about. Journey maps typically illustrate a specific experience, scenario, unfolding over time, for a specific use case or for a target persona or an audience segment. It's basically mapping out the actions and experiences that someone has. And then it can include information about the quality of that experience, including emotional states, thoughts and questions. It can also include things that are happening behind the scenes, backstage processes, employees or other folks that work within an organization that influence or mediate that experience, as well as technical or data or operational infrastructures that influence that experience. So at its core, it's just an experience laid out over time, but you can certainly layer lots of different types of information down on top of that journey. And when I talk about interactivity, you might imagine that we can take something like a very traditional journey map and make it interactive by making it digital. And I want to be very careful when I talk about interactivity, because I don't just mean taking something that is suitable for print in poster form and putting it on a screen. This is another good example to explain what I'm talking about here. So if you think about the old days of newspaper print form, when they initially made the shift to digital, a lot of newspapers just created essentially digital forms of their print newspaper. They made the newspaper in its form available on a glass screen. And that's what we called interactive for a little while. But that's not what I mean when I talk about interactivity. I think a better example of interactivity as a way to enhance the meaning and the value of something is more like some of what we see in interactive journalism and other similar pieces today. So for example, this is an article about CTE and head injuries in the NFL. And certainly the print piece, if I had just read it in print form, it was a great article, engaging, interesting, etc. But the interactive form that this took was really enriching because it had some neat interactivity around lighting up different brains based on what position a player played, when they played, etc. And it helped me understand what the article was trying to convey in a way that just reading the flat print form of the article could not do. So that's what we mean when we talk about interactivity. So I want to tell a few stories about how we've approached this at MadPow, because we've had to learn this sort of from scratch. I will mention there are some tools out there that attempt to make it possible to create interactive journey maps and similar artifacts, but in our searches, none of them have really achieved what we've ourselves needed to achieve. So most of what we've done, we've had to figure out through trial and error, and that's what I want to share with all of you. So I've got a few examples that I'll walk through, but more importantly, I'll share what we've learned and some practical tips, some do's and don'ts, if you're going to take this into your own practice. So before I get into some of those examples, I wanted to mention the very first time that we did this in any real meaningful way. We were working with a large financial services organization who's known for great customer service, and we were helping them envision, really re-envision, the end-to-end experience strategy for a large portion of their business. And in essence, we did a whole lot of experience strategy work that included lots of collaboration, and I will skip ahead through all of that to show you the journey map that we created that represented a future ideal state experience journey. It was huge because it was comprehensive, and it was a very large, complicated experience that could have a lot of routes and a lot of variations. So when we got to this point, we realized this is great, but it's not very useful. Not everybody's going to have room to hang up, a 40-foot long journey map. So while it was useful as an intermediate artifact for us to hang on the wall, to scribble over, to make changes and edits, and we do this in a very collaborative way, that's really where the value of that print piece was, to use this as an iterative process to revise and envision the future ideal state, but as a sort of final vision document to outline the ideal experience, a 40-foot long poster really wasn't going to be all that useful. So in this case, it was the first example where we said, what if we made this interactive so we could host it on a website, and that way people could interact with it and navigate through it by jumping around, clicking links, etc. And so we learned a lot from that process, and that's really what kickstarted this for us at MadPow. But what I'd rather share is what we learned from that. So one, journey maps can do a lot of things like they did for this example, improve the usability of an artifact with a lot of dense information. So in this case, this was a giant journey map with a lot of detail. It's hard to take all that in a 40-foot poster, but in an interactive version, you can step through and link forward and jump back, a little bit like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, a little easier to navigate. It can also make a unified experience vision available to distributed teams. So for example, if everybody works co-located in the same room, it may not be as much of an issue, but if an organization has people who are distributed or working remotely, being able to share that with all of them in an equally useful way can be tough. So having it hosted, say, on an internal server was valuable in this case because everybody, no matter where they were, could access the same information and see the same vision for the strategy and the experience that they were trying to create. The interactivity in this case can also help identify key opportunities within that experience, the most important points where we want to deliver something of important value to the customer, and to make recommendations in the context of the experience. So I'll show a few more examples of this, but one of the things interactivity can do really well is highlight moments in the experience where you can click and get a deep dive and see the supporting rationale, research, recommendations, examples, metrics, etc. But all of it is located in the context of the experience rather than in a separate report or document. One thing that interactive journey maps can't do is eliminate the need for the robust design, research, and strategy process that takes place leading up to it. So sometimes we hear people say, I'm really interested in interactive journey maps as an artifact. Can we get this in a quick way? And the answer is no. You still need to do the design, research, and strategy work to understand current state, experiences, and needs, identify opportunities, make recommendations, etc. So I want to take you through another example, and this was for a client who was looking at what they called the health experience ecosystem, and they asked us to evaluate their digital ecosystem. Now, what you see is blurry because I can't show it to you, but I want to give you an idea of when they said ecosystem, what they meant was a single PowerPoint slide that outlined, mostly from an IT perspective, the types of things that exist in the world that a patient might interact with that they could then use to synthesize data and provide insights back to that patient. So we were expecting, a big hairy ecosystem map. And in fact, it was actually a very small one-page summary. And they said, can you help us evaluate this and help us figure out how we might improve, make this ecosystem more powerful so we can better serve our patients who are, in this case, managing one or multiple chronic conditions at the same time. So we undertook that process, which started with just asking ourselves, what do we even mean by an ecosystem? If you Google ecosystem map, there are a lot of different things you'll find, but they all generally look similar in the sense that they are essentially a list of entities or things, people, organizations that exist and are somehow related to the topic at hand, in this case, a patient's experience with chronic condition management. The problem with an ecosystem map as a standalone artifact is that a lot of times they don't really show you the relationship or the value flow between entities in that ecosystem. They usually are like a list of ingredients from a recipe minus the recipe, or a list of parts at the beginning of your IKEA booklet minus the instructions on how to put them together. So it's kind of a parts list, but it's hard to make much meaning out of an ecosystem map if you're not going to build on it. And so that's actually what we ended up doing. We did the work to understand and map the full ecosystem of entities that influence patients managing these certain types of chronic conditions. And we looked at the relationship between all of them, and we started thinking about how all of this is really only going to make sense in the context of the experience journey that a patient goes through. So we started to think about that journey, and we mapped it. And of course, in this case, you'll notice is kind of, silly looking, because what we looked at was that this is not linear. The experience journey for certain things are linear, with a clear beginning and an end. Buy a plane ticket, go through a retail shopping experience, there's a beginning and an end. But for chronic condition management, there really isn't a beginning and an end. There's the onboarding when you're first diagnosed, but then ideally you get into an equilibrium and you're maintaining a level of wellness that hopefully stays the same or maybe even improves. But of course, we know that there are times where that equilibrium is going to be disrupted. You might find a new symptom arises, or test results reveal something surprising, or you have an acute flare-up or episode of some kind, depending on what we're talking about. So we started to map out how that journey unfolds in a circular way for those with chronic condition management, but at the same time asking ourselves, how could the ecosystem of all of the entities that influence that be mapped on top of that? And of course, as you might imagine, it got messy. And so we first created a kind of high-level draft, and then we had the aha that said, this is going to need to be interactive, because in order to convey the information here, we need to be able to do a deep dive to click into different components of this type of a map, so that this artifact can paint the picture of a future vision for an experience that could be executed by this client, and yet still give all of the context and relationship between all the things in the map. So we did this, we worked collaboratively with the client to refine, and ultimately through a couple rounds of revision, we ended up with this interactive form, which I'm actually going to switch over to my browser and show you. And one of the nice things that you can do with interactivity is that you can provide a little bit of an introduction, an onboarding tour of sorts, that can help provide a little context for what someone's about to look at, even if you don't have the benefit of being present to provide a voiceover. So what I'll do is take you through that introduction. And I will note that this particular example I'm showing you has been redacted, and all of the content has been replaced with just generic health content. So the words are really not the relevant piece here, but rather to demonstrate the interactivity of this particular tool. So in this case, we start with an introduction, which is to say the customer, or the patient in this case, is really at the heart of the whole experience. And then around the customer, as we build out this ecosystem, we identify core needs that are relevant to this particular experience or this patient or this customer. And these core needs might be different for different folks, but for the purposes of this work, they included things like educating someone about their condition, mitigating symptoms, and so forth. Then around that central portion, we identify all the other entities in the ecosystem. So these are all of the different things that this customer interacts with. It might be people, environments, devices, apps within this ecosystem. And each of these, in a way, acts as a data source. For this particular work, the interest was, what kind of information can we use and synthesize to provide insights back to the customer? So for example, collecting data in a passive way behind the scenes, as well as manual data tracking by or on behalf of the customer, such as, like, say, wearables like Fitbit and so forth, as well as environmental and community data that actually isn't provided by the customer at all, but might be things like the weather. And so all of that data and all of those entities in the different categories, such as physical or environmental or social, are outlined here in this ecosystem map. There is also, in this case, an additional layer that covers questions related to how that data is synthesized. And this might not be relevant to all experiences, but for this one, we were thinking a lot about how that information is going to be aggregated and interpreted. And there are a number of ways that can happen. So there might be rules and a preference engine that's kind of built over time, could be using machine learning and predictive analytics, could be evidence-based care pathways that are defined depending on the health conditions at play, if this is health specific, although this one doesn't have to be related to health at all. And in return, the platform would deliver, or this ecosystem or this solution, whatever it might be, could deliver back actionable insights, an action plan or decision support, alerts, nudges, etc. And then the outer ring is what shows us the experience journey. So in this case, you can see the top left, the patient, or the customer in this case, is onboarded when they are first diagnosed with whatever chronic condition we might be thinking about. And in a perfect world, they would maintain a healthy equilibrium. That's that outer ring. And you'll notice that sometimes people say that, the ideal experience is going to have as few touch points as possible. But really, if I'm managing my health and wellness, that doesn't mean I'm not having any kind of interactions. There are still things that a healthy equilibrium includes, like preventative care checkups and certain life events that are going to be part of a normal, healthy life. So there is still going to be some level of interaction happening, even in a healthy equilibrium. But then, of course, there will also be things that happen. That's what these little bubbles represent, that sort of kick you out of your equilibrium, that disrupt the equilibrium. And each of those is represented by one of these bubbles. And you'll notice that they are different levels of severity or distance from the equilibrium, depending on what these things represent. And then lastly, we identify the key moments that are tied to this experience. So in this case, it's more than just saying, here's what the ecosystem looks like, here's what the experience looks like, but also identifying moments in time where this particular ecosystem and anything we might build around it, an intervention system, an app, a service, whatever it might be, these are the moments where we have the opportunity to help mitigate frustration, alleviate some pain points, or even preempt some of the challenges in the first place by delivering insights and supporting healthy decision making at all these key places. And that's what these little orange icons represent. And in this particular little introduction, it includes a little how-to video that just walks you through essentially what I've just walked you through, but then it drops folks off right at the map. And this is a little bit funky in sizing just because of the way I have the browser set up here, but you can see now that you can interact. And if I click on one of these, for example, these moments, so this might be an acute episode, a flare-up of some kind. I click on that, and what I see are that certain icons light up. It's saying that these are the key moments that are associated with this type of an event. And as I do that, I can see that different entities are going to light up over time that show me which key moments are tied to those. If I do click on one of those key moments, you'll also notice that I can get a little information about that key moment. It's an opportunity, basically. And so it's information about that opportunity. It tells me which entities in the ecosystem are relevant to that key moment. So for example, which data sources are really going to play a critical role in delivering an intervention or a service at this point in time. And I can see those light up here in the visual map, but I can also see those listed here in the panel, and I can get a deep dive around that moment by clicking. And this again is redacted generic content, but it's just a representation of the type of thing you might include in a deep dive from an interactive map. So specific recommendations, research, rationale. This is valuable because a lot of times we hear from so many folks, they've done a lot of wonderful research, but the research itself and the insights end up in a document that isn't really tied to anything else and can end up in a drawer. In this case, you could imagine specific quotes, even audio video clips here to demonstrate the type of insight that supports the recommendations around this key opportunity. You can include things like considerations for execution and capability, partnerships, how we could measure impact, key metrics, analogous examples, and so forth. And so each of these key moments or opportunities would have a deep dive of that sort. So that's a quick example of what we ultimately created for this particular client. And we learned quite a lot. So here are a few more of our learnings through that process. One, interactive journey maps can certainly help you articulate innovative experience strategies in a really customized format. So in this case, you'll notice, as I mentioned, this ended up being a circular journey map hybrid with ecosystem map. And essentially, that was very custom to the need of this work, but making an interactive map can essentially provide that level of custom build that a lot of existing tools can't. It can also become a scalable, editable, living design artifact. So if this is something that gets hosted on an internal server, as parts of that experience are built or changed or executed over time, you can make updates, you can edit and change or add research documents to support different parts of the experience. It can also tie the experience recommendations to supporting research artifacts. So as I mentioned, seeing some maybe video clips of research right there in the context of the experience to support the recommendations can be very powerful. But interactive journey maps cannot do any of the above if they're not shared and integrated with internal design team workflows, meaning this needs to be built in a way that the internal teams can then use it in a realistic manner. So the overview at the beginning was going to be really ideal for sharing with folks that were just walking up to this map without any context. If they didn't have that, it wouldn't be valuable. The high-level view is more valuable to folks who just want to see what the journey is going to be like over time, whereas the deep dive provides the details for design and development teams to think about what's going to need to be at play to deliver a future experience. I also want to share another example, also happens to be health related, although we've done plenty of these in the non-health sphere. But this was another good example where we needed to map an experience, but in this case, the ask was not just to map the vaccination experience, but it was to do it for the purpose of creating a discussion aid or a tool to help this organization have conversations about vaccination experience with customers to help improve that experience, and ultimately increase vaccination rates. So kind of a complex ask. And what you're looking at here is essentially one of the most common things you find if you Google vaccination experience map. Because I'll be honest with you, when we started this project, I said to myself, man, somebody must have already done a lot of robust work to map the experience people have for vaccination. And even if we look specifically at adolescent and adult vaccination, there's still got to be something out there. And actually, there isn't too much. There's a lot of stuff that looks like this, which is very much from the health provider's point of view. This is not a map that is built from the patient perspective by any means. And there are also maps out there that are actually mapped from the point of view of the vaccine. So the exciting journey of vaccines, this is a map created that shows the journey the vaccine goes on as it's developed over time from R&D out to market access. But there was actually quite a dearth of actual experience mapping from the patient perspective, what it's like to be a patient and get vaccinated. So we did quite a lot of research to understand the patient experience, and we collaborated with our clients and our end users and providers and patients and caregivers and families to understand that full experience end to end, and to understand all of the places where somebody might either experience frustration or uncertainty, or where there exist barriers to successfully getting vaccinated. And so what we ultimately created included a number of insights over the course of the vaccination experience. And I'm actually going to flip over to show you that live. So what this map ended up doing, rather than some traditional journey maps that are designed to just, again, paint the picture of an experience, either a current state experience or to demonstrate what an ideal future state experience might look like, this map was designed to function as a tool that could be a discussion aid, so that somebody who is talking to providers about the vaccination experience can walk them through it and say, look at what the vaccination experience is like for most of your patients. Let's talk about where that experience is falling down and where we can do better. And so this map, and I'll zoom out just briefly to give you an idea, very robust, lots of detail, but like the other map, interactivity can help us make sense of all of this. So you'll notice the top left here includes a little introduction. So it kind of explains what you're looking at. This diagram is designed to illustrate the vaccination experience from a patient-centered perspective. And by understanding that vaccination experience in the context of people and objects that impact it, we can highlight the key opportunities for healthcare providers and systems and health information technology solutions to help intervene and improve that experience. And then there's a little introduction to the map and the parts of the map itself. So this particular map articulates not just the patient's experience, which is the top row, but it also identifies other people in the system who influence that experience. And so we'll talk about that briefly. And each row is one of those contributors. So there's a row for providers. This would be prescribing providers, physicians, and NPs, as well as clinical staff like nurses and MAs. And it also includes some technology rows as well. So the patient portal would be the patient-facing side of that technology, and then behind the scenes, electronic health records. Each of the columns represents an action or a part of the experience, and those are grouped into phases as well. And then you'll notice that along the map, there are a few places, not every single step, but a few places where we have a link to get a deep dive, to view more insights related to that moment in time. So this is a little bit like those orange icons in the last map that's saying this is a key opportunity or a key moment where we want to look at ways we could improve the experience based on what happens at this critical moment in time. The other thing you'll notice is that there are these three different shades, if you will, within the patient experience row. These represent the quality of the experience that they're having. And this was important for us to call out because in this case, the quality of the experience somebody has isn't necessarily the exact same as whether or not they get vaccinated. There are some folks who will go through an experience, be successfully vaccinated, which is great, but may not have a great experience, and that can impact future health impact and engagement, as well as others in their family that they might be more or less likely to recommend vaccination to. So it's important to understand both the check of do they get vaccinated or not, but also to understand what the quality of the experience is like and how to improve it. So if you scroll across, you'll see there are the steps of the process, there are the different qualities, there are places where we can try to improve the quality of the experience by doing certain things, and we've called these out along the way. And I won't get into too many of the details. You know, there's an important point here where they make the decision, they have the discussion, they decide whether to vaccinate or to wait or to decline, follow up, come back for future visits, or additional vaccines, etc. And then below you can see that the contributors are in the rows below. So the provider row with the key actions and steps, touch points that they are engaging with the patient, as well as the clinical staff. And then similarly with technology, the patient portal and the EHR and the ways that this technology can play an important role in giving rise to this experience. And in this case, the interactivity does help us organize the information. If I want to focus on just one row, if I want to collapse some of this so that I don't see as much, I certainly can. Additionally, when I click on one of these key moments to get a deep dive, what it does is provide me some additional information. So some basic introduction around that moment, what it means, research insights related to it, best practices that might be related to health information technology, aspirational ideas for the future. And these are different. So each of them has a different set of information, provider best practices, behavioral best practices, and they have a couple features here as well, including a little jump menu that'll, essentially scroll you down or up to different portions of that deep dive, as well as links out to additional materials where relevant. And in this case, there's a checkbox that says prioritize, you'll notice. I'll show you what that does. So there is a menu, and one of the things we heard feedback from when we were collaborating to revise this was, hey, let's see if we could bookmark some of these. So if I were to check that box where it said priority, it would show up here. So there's nothing there right now, but if I were to say, hey, you know what, this is priority for me. Maybe in the course of a conversation, I'm viewing this, again, it's maybe a discussion aid. We say, this is a moment where we're really struggling. So we want to prioritize this. We want to bookmark the information that's here and maybe here as well. When I go back to view the priority list, now I will see those two key points that I had bookmarked listed here. And in essence, it just makes it easy to do a quick printout of those key moments. Additionally, there's a table of contents that functions both as an overview, an actual table of contents, as well as a quick navigation menu. So I can jump to any of these moments very quickly if I know what I want to go to or zoom in on. And similarly, it can give me a quick link to the insights that are tied to some of those different moments in time. So again, that's just a quick preview, and it's meant to show some of the value of the interactivity, not so much the specific content, but I want to share what we learned from this example. So in this case, we found that journey maps can certainly act as a very powerful storytelling tool, and they were being used in a unique way by this organization because they wanted to use this map not just as something for internal design, but to have as a tool that they have in hand when they are having conversations with some of their customers and other stakeholders in the system. So being able to walk through that in a way that you can control through interactivity can be very powerful. It can also empower meaningful discussion and sharing of best practices that you tie to the moments in the map, as you saw. And it can provide a great resource for improved strategy planning and alignment for internal teams who look at this and say, hey, we have a lot of great material that supports, or resources that support better experiences at each of those moments. But hey, we have a gap here and we need more resources to support at that moment in time. So it can help teams in that way. But as usual, there are some things we learned as well that our journey maps cannot do, and that is they cannot do the work of smart humans creating guiding smart dialogue and building personalized solutions. So essentially, there's a little bit of a typo here, sorry about that, but what we learned was that this is a tool and it's not going to be able to replace the human who is having a dialogue about the experience. So to just hand this map to somebody without any context wouldn't be all that useful. This was designed specifically with the use case of being a discussion aid, so you still need to have engaged smart humans using this tool in a way that empowers a dialogue that can lead to better experience design. So all that said, those are just a couple of the examples of the interactive journey maps that MadPow has been working on over the last couple of years. And just to give you the high level, hey, what have we learned overall? If you want to try to do this in your own practice, what are the things you need to be thinking about? So, number one, you definitely need to think about your audience. And what I mean by that is, who is the map going to serve? Who's going to use it and how? For example, is it going to be designers that are crafting products and services? Then they need the details. They need to know exactly what type of things this experience needs to do, what it needs to deliver, how it's going to do so. Versus developers who might be using this as a reference, they're going to need sort of that high-level summary criteria to know whether or not what they are building is delivering what it needs to deliver. So this isn't going to take the place of user stories in Jira, but it might help if you can craft this in a way that can be tied to or integrated with that work to give acceptance criteria some meaning in the context of a map. Leadership are not going to want the level of detail that dedicated design teams need. They're going to want these maps to help them socialize a vision, so they need to be clear and actionable. And this is where the interactivity can really help, because the interactivity can provide a high-level overview, the executive summary, with clear actionable recommendations, but then you can use interactivity to provide a deep dive to serve the needs of, for example, designers and developers. Another thing you need to be thinking about are the use cases. So what purpose is an interactive map going to actually serve that a static one can't? For example, providing a more intuitive way to share a complex end-to-end experience journey. That's great, they can do this. But what that means is you need to make sure that the interactive map includes some intuitive high-level navigation. If the whole point of interactivity is to make the map easier to share if it's really complex and make it easier to navigate, then you need to actually make sure that it has an easy way to navigate. So you need to build that navigation or some way of intuitively engaging with the map into the map. If one of the goals is to make research and strategy insights available to remote teams, then you need to make sure that the map, in whatever form it takes, provides that deep dive functionality to give that level of detail to those teams so that they don't have to go hunting for it somewhere else. If part of the goal is to visualize relationships between entities in an ecosystem, you need to be able to provide that tagging or other functionality that lets you indicate where there are relationships or where there is influence between items in the experience map. And these are just some examples, but the recommendation I'm making here is to think deliberately in advance, what are the goals for an interactive map, and to make sure you build that into anything that you're actually going to develop. This might sound obvious, but you also need to think very explicitly about the UX. In a way, an interactive journey map becomes a little mini UX problem. So you need to make sure you actually build time into your project plan for that. That means actually doing some sketching and wireframing of the structure of the interactive artifact itself. You can't just design a journey map as if it was going to be a print map and then say, make it digital, because there are going to be interesting challenges around the structure and the nature of the interactivity that can change how someone engages with the information. You also need to make sure that you're collaborating with the developers or the designers who are going to code it. And there are a lot of ways to do this that are very simple, that range from just some simple HTML with some hotspots all the way up to really robust front-end code that can get very complicated. But if you're collaborating all the way through with the folks that are going to actually build this, you will be much more efficient. You also need to make sure that you evaluate the usability of the map itself with the people who are going to use it, not just your team. So for example, if you are building this for a client, or if you are building this for particular stakeholders, make sure that they have an opportunity to interact with early versions of the interactive artifact so that they know what they're going to do with it and how to use the interactivity. In other words, make a really early case for putting time in the project for the development and testing efforts. The end result is going to be a lot more robust and do a much better job of tying your prior investments, like research, to the intended experience outcomes. And you also need to think about the content. For all my content people in the house, you need to figure out the content of the map first before you decide how interactivity is going to enhance it, or if it won't enhance it. So don't build the airplane as you fly it in this case. Don't skip the experience, research, and strategy phases of work that need to happen. Those need to happen first to inform the content and the structure of the map. Only then are you going to know how interactivity will enhance it. And make sure that you seek collaboration from stakeholders in shaping the experience vision. This ties back to the previous point. So if you know that they are invested in how those recommendations and that vision takes place, you will be much more successful. And then make sure that you get their collaboration once you are actually testing it and seeing how it works to know that interactivity can enhance it. I'll also say that there are times where interactive journey maps may not be the right solution. For example, if you're a small co-located team with a short-term goal and very limited scope, an interactive map really isn't going to add much to what you're trying to do. If you're just mapping the current state experience, you're not really thinking about ideal future experience visions right now, and all you're seeking to do is articulate what the current experience is like, making a robust interactive journey map's really not going to add a lot of value to that process. If you just need an internal artifact with a very short shelf life to illustrate a small snippet of a larger experience, again, building in the interactivity isn't going to add a lot of value. And if you have no supplemental material or data to layer on top of a user flow, if you've just basically got a user experience with no additional deep dive information, then the interactivity is really not going to add a lot other than maybe helping you navigate, from beginning to end. But there's really no need to make it interactive in order to be able to engage with it in that case. So, in other words, you're all designers, or you work in the design world. Apply what you know to what you know. It's a meta design challenge. So think about your audiences, think about your use cases, think about what the content of a strategy deliverable, like a journey map or a service blueprint, aims to do. What is it trying to convey? And then say, what value will interactivity bring to this? That's how you build your interactive journey maps. So I will end there, but I certainly welcome questions. As I mentioned, I tried to build in some of the details that I've received in Q&As as I've given this talk in the past, but if you have thoughts or questions or want to learn more, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can email me here at my email address, find me on Twitter, and I would love to hear from you.